Thunder didn't just roll across Lagos that night. It roared like something divine had lost its patience. Lightning painted the clouds in white fire, striking over Victoria Island, where power slept behind glass walls. In one of those mansions, where silence cost millions and guilt was buried under gold, Chief Olumide Adebanjo, one of Nigeria's most feared and envied men, lay dying. His breath rasped like sandpaper on stone, and for the first time in his empire of triumphs, he looked afraid. The monitors blinked beside him, their light cutting through the darkness, each beep like a whisper from fate. You cannot buy tomorrow. Outside, the sea raged against the shore. Inside, the air was thick with sterilized fear. Nurses moved quietly, their shoes gliding across marble floors, while the private doctor whispered to an assistant in a language only power understands. The billionaire's body was still, but his mind was burning. He had once ruled boardrooms like a king, his words enough to destroy careers and command fortunes. But now, all his influence had shrunk into this single room, into this small trembling hand, clutching the edge of his blanket, like a child, begging for forgiveness. In the faint reflection of the window, his own eyes looked back at him, eyes that had seen everything, yet understood nothing until now. They were filled not with the fear of death, but of memory. Because somewhere in that collapsing heart of his, another storm had been raging for 20 years. The night he turned away, a woman who loved him, and left a child behind. He remembered her face through the haze of fever. Amara, her tears mixing with rain, her voice breaking as she said, "You'll regret this, Olumide." He had laughed then, walked away, and built his fortune on that same arrogance. But time, like a silent judge, never forgets. Now, lying beneath sterile lights and humming machines, he felt that same laugh choke him from within. The doctor's voice cut through his thoughts. "Chief, can you hear me?" No answer. Sweat ran down his temples. His chest heaved as his mind blurred into visions. In that vision, the hospital walls melted into thunderclouds. He was no longer in his bed. He was standing again in that doorway 20 years ago, watching Amara walk away with their baby in her arms. Her cry mixed with the wind. His hand had twitched then, wanting to stop her, but pride had pulled it back. He watched her go, never knowing that one moment of silence would one day echo so loud. "Chief!" The doctor's shout dragged him back to the present. The lights flickered. Monitors screamed. His children rushed in. Tunda, tall and impatient, his phone still in hand. Adaora, polished and cold, clutching designer worry. But none of them came close. None of them could see the terror in their father's eyes as he stared past them, into something only the dying can see. The thunder outside grew louder, matching the uneven rhythm of his failing heart. His lips trembled, his fingers clawed weakly at the blanket, as though reaching for something far beyond the room. Then, for a fleeting second, his expression softened. His gaze fixed on an invisible face hovering at the edge of the storm. His mouth moved, slowly, painfully, but the words carried a lifetime. A flash of lightning filled the room, blinding white against the glass. The machines hissed, then steadied. The nurses leaned in, and through the static hum, his voice broke the silence, frail, yet unmistakable. "Ifunanya," he whispered. The name hung in the air like a ghost refusing to leave. No one in the room recognized it, but they all felt the weight of it, the kind of name that could haunt an empire. As thunder cracked again above the city, Chief Olumide's eyes fluttered shut, and the storm swallowed his last breath. The morning sun rose over Nsukka not with warmth, but with a cruel kind of memory. Its light crawled through the cracked windows of a small bungalow, touching the face of a woman who had long stopped believing in miracles. Ifunanya sat beside a smoking stove, folding her son's school uniform, when the old radio on the shelf crackled to life, its voice carrying the kind of news that wakes ghosts. Business magnate, Chief Olumide AbaA, remains in critical condition after suffering cardiac arrest late last night, the announcer said. The wooden spoon slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. The name, the same name her mother had once spat through tears, filled the little room like a curse returning home. The kettle whistled. Her son laughed in the background. But all Ifunanya heard was the sound of rain from 20 years ago and her mother's dying whisper, "Never beg a man who left you crying." For a long moment, she stood frozen, her heart trapped between disbelief and anger. The man who had ruined her mother's life now fought for his own, surrounded by machines and money. Yet none of it could buy forgiveness. Ifunanya closed her eyes, trying to swallow the bitterness rising like smoke. She had thought she was free of that past. But pain, once buried, has a way of learning to breathe again. Her home was humble, a single-room dwelling of cracked walls and fading paint, but within it lived dignity. A small chalkboard leaned against the wall, the remnants of her lessons from the day before. Her students called her Teacher Nanya, a woman of grace and wisdom who spoke softly, yet carried authority. No one knew how much weight that calm voice carried. No one saw the nights she sat awake, clutching her mother's picture, whispering the questions she never got to ask. Her mother, Amara, had been the kind of woman whose laughter could make hardship tremble. But love had betrayed her. When Olumide cast her out, pregnant and ashamed, the world turned cold. Amara worked the markets by day and stitched clothes by candlelight, her hands rough, her body frail. She had died, whispering her daughter's name, her last tear falling before she could even say goodbye. Ifunanya had buried her youth beside that grave. Since then, she had built a life on discipline, faith, and silence. Every lesson she taught was about forgiveness, yet she could never teach herself the same. Her son, Chuka, 7 years old, was her only light. He had her mother's eyes, full of hope that refused to die. "Mama, are you okay?" he asked that morning, watching her stare into nothing. She forced a smile, smoothing his hair. "I'm fine, my dear. Go get your bag." But her voice trembled, betraying the lie. That evening, the world outside softened under the first drops of rain. The streets shimmered under flickering yellow bulbs, and thunder rumbled far away, like the echo of something she couldn't yet name. Ifunanya sat by the window, mending her son's torn sleeve, when she heard it. A slow, deliberate knock on the door. It was not the hurried rap of a neighbor, but the firm tap of someone who had traveled far and carried purpose. She hesitated before opening it. On her doorstep stood a man in a dark suit, drenched from the road. He looked out of place in her world of dust and simplicity. His voice was low, respectful. "Madam Ifunanya." She nodded cautiously. He removed a gold-sealed envelope from his case, its wax glinting in the candlelight. "This is from Lagos," he said. "Your father requests your presence before he dies." The words struck like thunder breaking through the roof. For a heartbeat, the world went silent, only the rain tapping gently against the window pane. She stared at the letter, her breath uneven, her heart pounding. Her fingers trembled as she reached out but stopped midway, afraid to touch the past that had already burned her once. "My father," she whispered, almost to herself. The messenger nodded, eyes heavy with pity. "He said only you can give him peace." The candle flickered wildly, casting their shadows across the wall, and in that light, Ifunanya saw not just the man who abandoned them, but the reckoning her heart had spent a lifetime preparing for. The road from poverty to power is long, but the road back to pain is always shorter. The sun had barely risen when Ifunanya stood at the edge of Nsukka's dusty bus park, a small suitcase at her feet, and a storm in her heart. The air smelled of diesel, sweat, and uncertainty. Her hands trembled as she clutched the gold-sealed letter that had stolen her sleep the night before, a summons from the man whose name she had sworn never to speak. Chief Olumide AbaA, her father, the man who had abandoned her mother and left her childhood buried in tears. The bus to Lagos was old, its seats cracked and its windows stubborn against the morning wind. As she climbed aboard, her son's voice echoed in her mind. "Mama, when will you come back?" She had promised soon, but even she didn't believe her words. She wasn't going home. She was walking into the past, into the den of the lion, who had once devoured everything her mother was. As the bus rumbled out of town, the fields of green turned to dust, the horizon swallowed by heat. The passengers chattered loudly, traders counting money, mothers calming crying babies, men arguing about politics. But amid the noise, one voice cut through. "Did you hear? That big man from Lagos, Chief Olumide, is dying," said a woman in bright Ankara, fanning herself. "They say he's cursed, all his wealth, and yet no peace." Another laughed. "Serves him right. Men like that forget those they crush." Ifunanya turned her face toward the window, her throat tightening. None of them knew the woman sitting quietly beside them carried his blood in her veins. None of them knew the ghost they mocked was her father. The bus jolted over a pothole, and she pressed her palm against her chest, trying to calm the storm rising inside. Why now? She thought. Why call for me when his breath is running out? Part of her wanted to ignore the letter, to let him die without her forgiveness. But beneath that anger, a voice she hated whispered, "Go. End it. Not for him, for you." Hours passed. The road stretched endlessly, lined with villages that blurred into memory. She watched mothers carrying baskets on their heads, barefoot children chasing after trucks, old men sitting beneath mango trees, faces that reminded her of her mother's struggle, of all the years they survived without help. Every scene tore her open a little more, until the fire of hatred that had burned in her chest began to tremble against something softer. Compassion. But compassion was dangerous. It was the same weakness that had broken Amara. As the bus neared Lagos, the landscape changed. Dust became glass. Silence became noise. The skyline rose in the distance, towers gleaming beneath the afternoon haze, proud and merciless. Lagos, the city of kings and beggars, waited like judgment itself. The air grew heavy with exhaust and tension. Ifunanya's reflection in the window looked like a stranger, a woman standing at the edge of destiny. Her fingers brushed the letter again, tracing the golden seal. She imagined his face, older now, weaker. Would she even recognize him? Would she see regret or just the same arrogance that once tore her mother's world apart? Her mind spun with questions, each one heavier than the next. The driver shouted over the music, "Oshodi Terminal! Last stop!" The bus lurched to a halt amid chaos, hawkers shouting, engines growling, crowds pushing. Ifunanya stepped down slowly, her suitcase in hand, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. The city air hit her, humid, alive, unforgiving. She barely had time to breathe before the crowd around her parted. A convoy of black SUVs rolled to a stop, engines purring like beasts. The doors opened, and men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the crowd until one of them approached her. "Miss Ifunanya," he said, his tone respectful yet firm. "Chief AbaA has been waiting for you." The world seemed to pause. Around her, the city roared on, but inside, only silence remained. The silence before walking into the lion's den. The mansion loomed over Victoria Island like a monument built by pride and haunted by regret. Rain dripped from its marble edges, sliding down walls that had once reflected light, but now seemed to breathe like a tomb. When Ifunanya stepped out of the black SUV, her shoes touched the same driveway where her mother had once stood, heartbroken and drenched in tears. The gates closed behind her with a metallic groan, sealing her inside the empire that had destroyed everything she loved. The air was heavy, perfumed with old money and loneliness. The house itself looked alive. Its chandeliers glimmered faintly, its walls whispered memories she could almost hear. As she walked up the grand staircase, her reflection followed in the polished marble floor like a ghost refusing to fade. Portraits lined the walls, paintings of Olumide, his wife, their legitimate children, and generations of wealthy ancestors staring down in silent judgment. Not one frame carried her face, not one name bore a trace of her existence. She was an unwelcome echo in a house that had tried to forget her mother's name. A butler, old and gray, waited at the landing. His posture stiffened when he saw her. His eyes, however, betrayed recognition. "Madame Ifunanya," he whispered, voice trembling. You look just like—" He stopped himself, bowing quickly. She could see it in his face. He had been there the day her mother was sent away. His silence was his guilt. "The chief is upstairs," he said quietly. "He's been waiting." As she followed him through the corridors, every step felt heavier, every corner colder. The walls seemed to hum with secrets. The faint ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like a countdown to something inevitable. She passed the dining hall, its long table still set with silver cutlery, though no one ate there anymore. The smell of wax and wilted roses filled her lungs. Then came the voice, sharp and cutting, from behind her. "So it's true." Ifunanya turned. Standing at the end of the corridor was Mrs. Adebanjo, Olumide's wife, a woman wrapped in silk and bitterness. Her face was carefully painted, but no color could hide the frost in her eyes. "The stray finally found her way back," she sneered. "Did he send for you because he's dying, or because guilt finally found him?" Ifunanya's hands tightened around the handle of her bag, but her voice stayed calm. "I didn't come here for money," she said softly. "I came because he asked." Mrs. Adebanjo's laugh was hollow. "He's delirious, not repentant. Don't think his weakness gives you power here. You may share his blood, but you'll never share his name." Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she walked away, her perfume lingering like poison. The butler lowered his head as Ifunanya continued down the corridor, his voice barely a whisper. "Pay her no mind, ma'am. The chief's illness has changed him. He's not the man he was." "I know," she said quietly, her eyes fixed ahead. "That's why I'm here." They reached the master bedroom, a room larger than her entire home in Suka. The curtains were half drawn, and the scent of medicine clung to the air. Machines beeped softly in the background, their rhythm steady but weak. On the bed lay Chief Olumide Adebanjo, the man whose name had once commanded the nation, now just a shadow of what he used to be. His skin was pale, his chest rose and fell with effort, his lips moving as though whispering to unseen spirits. Ifunanya hesitated at the door, her heart pounding. This was the man who had destroyed her mother's life. This was the father she had never known. The storm of 2 decades swirled behind her eyes, but she stepped forward slowly, silently, as though entering sacred ground. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and the sound stirred him awake. His eyes fluttered open, clouded, weak but suddenly wide with shock. His gaze locked onto her, searching her face as though seeing a ghost. His breath hitched, his lips trembled, and his voice, rough as gravel, broke through the air. You have her eyes." His chest rose sharply, and his face twisted with something between fear and awe. "Your mother's curse has returned." The heart monitor beeped wildly as lightning flared through the window, casting her shadow across his bed. The daughter he denied, standing before him at last. Silence had never been this loud. The machines hummed in rhythm with the rain against the window, but inside the master bedroom, time itself seemed afraid to move. Chief Olumide Adebanjo lay propped against his pillows, his once powerful frame now reduced to trembling bones and shallow breaths. Across from him sat Ifunanya, still and composed, her face unreadable, her eyes holding 20 years of questions that had never been answered. Between them hung the unspoken truth, the silence of a father who had run from love, and the daughter who had learned to live without it. The doctor, sensing the tension that filled the air like smoke, adjusted Olumide's IV drip, and turned to Ifunanya. "Please, madam, keep him calm," he said softly. "His heart is fragile." "I understand," she replied quietly, her voice even, but her chest burning. The doctor nodded once, then slipped out of the room, closing the door behind him. And with that small sound, the click of wood against metal, they were alone. For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain whispered against the glass, and the faint ticking of the wall clock marked every second of their shared silence. Olumide turned his head slowly, his gaze tracing the features of the woman sitting beside him. The resemblance was undeniable. Amara's eyes, Amara's calm, even the way she sat, proud yet gentle, was her mother reborn. His throat constricted. "You came," he said finally, the words scraping through his chest. Ifunanya didn't answer immediately. Her fingers rested on her lap, her knuckles pale with restraint. "I came because you asked," she said. "Not because I forgave." He flinched, the words cutting deeper than she could see. "You have her voice," he murmured. "Soft, but dangerous." The silence returned, thick, suffocating. Then, as if he couldn't bear it, Olumide reached for the drawer beside his bed. His trembling hand pulled out a brown envelope and pushed it toward her. "Take this," he said. "It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's something." Ifunanya stared at the envelope as though it were poison. Her jaw tightened, her chest rising and falling slowly. "You think money fixes ghosts?" she asked. "You think that's what my mother needed when you left her to die?" He closed his eyes, pain flashing across his face. "I was a fool," he said weakly. "I was scared. The world judged me for loving her. I thought success would make the shame disappear." "Did it?" she asked. His eyes opened, glistening under the pale light. "No," he whispered. "It just made the emptiness louder." Her voice cracked, the mask finally slipping. "Then tell me, Chief Adebanjo, my father, did you ever love her?" The question lingered in the air, fragile yet sharp enough to bleed. He turned away, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. His hand trembled as he pressed it against his chest, as if trying to hold together the pieces of a heart that had been breaking for decades. "Love her?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I destroyed the only woman who ever loved me. I traded her for pride, and I've paid every day since." Ifunanya swallowed hard, her throat aching. The man before her was not the monster she had imagined. He was smaller, weaker, haunted. Yet that did not erase the years of suffering that his choices had carved into her life. "Then why call me now?" she asked softly. "What do you want from me?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw a man stripped of everything except truth. His lips trembled, his voice breaking under its own weight. "I called because I can't die like this," he said. "Because when I see you, I see her. The forgiveness I never earned." A tear slid down his cheek, his breathing growing uneven. "I destroyed the only woman who ever loved me. And you're all I have left." His voice faltered, his eyes pleading, not for mercy, but for a moment of peace that only she could give. The monitor beeped faster, the storm outside grew louder, and for the first time, the daughter he denied found herself holding the life of the man who had once broken hers. Lagos had always been a city that fed on whispers, and, by morning, the whispers had turned into fire. Every headline screamed the same name, Chief Olumide Adebanjo, and beneath it, the question that made the nation's blood stir. Who is the mystery woman visiting the dying billionaire's mansion? Cameras flashed at the estate gates, reporters crowded the driveway, and the air around Victoria Island smelled of rain, greed, and curiosity. Inside those iron gates, Ifunanya sat by a window, her reflection framed against a stormy skyline, unaware that her quiet grief had become breaking news. Her phone buzzed endlessly. Unknown numbers, messages from journalists pretending to care. They called her the secret daughter, The forgotten bloodline. The scandal that came too late. Outside, reporters shouted into microphones, their voices cutting through the storm like hungry crows. But inside, the true storm was brewing, not in the skies, but in the hearts of those who carried the Adebanjo name. In the living room, Tunde and Adaora, Olumide's legitimate children, sat with the family lawyer, their faces tight with anger. "We have to do something," Adaora hissed. "She shows up out of nowhere, and suddenly father is acting like a saint." Tunde's jaw tightened. "That woman's not family. She's the reason he's dying faster. She brings guilt, not peace." The lawyer, gray-haired and cautious, cleared his throat. "She's done nothing wrong. The chief asked to see her." "Asked," Adaora snapped. "He hasn't asked for us in weeks. Now she comes, and suddenly we're invisible." Their mother, standing near the window, folded her arms, her silence sharper than her children's anger. "Don't fool yourselves," she said coldly. "If she's come this far, she wants something." Upstairs, Ifunanya could hear their voices echo through the walls. Each word felt like the past repeating itself, the same cruelty her mother had faced, the same rejection dressed in different clothes. She closed her eyes, fighting the ache that rose in her chest. She had not come for money, or forgiveness, or even recognition. She had come because a dying man had asked. And now, all she wanted was to leave. She walked quietly down the corridor toward her father's room. The sound of his weak breathing filled the air, the machine steady but faint. He was asleep, face pale, fingers twitching as though chasing ghosts in his dreams. She stood by the door for a long moment, watching him with a heart that didn't know whether to hate or mourn. "Rest," she whispered softly. "Whatever peace you're looking for, I hope you find it." As she turned to leave, she found the family lawyer waiting by the staircase. His eyes carried both pity and respect. "Miss Ifunanya," he said, his tone gentle but formal. "A word, please." She followed him into her father's study, a room filled with books, awards, and photographs of a life that had never included her. Papers lay scattered across the mahogany desk, and beside them sat a thick folder sealed with the Adebanjo family crest. The lawyer hesitated, his fingers brushing the envelope before he spoke. "Your father gave me specific instructions," he said slowly, "in case he doesn't recover." Ifunanya's expression remained calm, though her stomach tightened. "Whatever it is, I don't want it," she said. "His legacy isn't mine." The lawyer exhaled. "I thought you'd say that." He handed her the envelope anyway. "But sometimes, destiny doesn't ask what we want. It simply arrives." She looked down at the envelope, the golden seal gleaming beneath the soft light. The same emblem that once represented power now felt like a chain. Her pulse quickened, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, thick and white, stamped with her father's signature. The lawyer's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Miss Ifunanya," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Your father named you next of kin. The Adebanjo estate, every holding, every company. It's all been transferred to you." The paper slipped from her hand, fluttering to the floor. For a moment, the house fell utterly silent, as though even the walls were stunned. Down the hall, thunder rolled again, not from the sky, but from the weight of a legacy built on sin, now resting in the hands of the daughter he once left behind. The empire that once bent to Chief Olumide Adebanjo's command now trembled beneath the weight of his silence. The grand boardroom of Adebanjo Holdings, once a cathedral of wealth and fear, had become a courtroom of betrayal. The air was thick with murmurs, ambition, and panic. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat the company's directors, men who had built their fortunes from Olumide's name. On the other side sat his legitimate heirs, Tunde and Adaora, their faces masks of entitlement. And at the far end, alone and uninvited, stood Ifunanya, the daughter they called a mistake. The news of her inheritance had detonated like a bomb across Lagos. By noon, every newspaper headline carried her face beside her father's. Unknown daughter named sole heir. The world demanded answers. Reporters swarmed the estate gates, microphones pressed forward like weapons, demanding the truth about the woman who had emerged from nowhere to inherit billions. But while the city burned with curiosity, Ifunanya remained silent. She had not asked for this empire, and yet it was now hers. Inside the boardroom, voices rose like thunder. "This is madness." Tunde's fist slammed against the table. "He wasn't in his right mind. She manipulated him." AbaA leaned forward, venom in her tone. "Our father built this company. You think we'll let some roadside teacher take it from us?" The lawyer, seated quietly beside the will, spoke with care. The chief was of sound mind. His signature was witnessed by— "Enough," AbaA snapped. "She's not family. She's a scandal with a surname." Ifunanya's gaze did not waver. She had walked through hunger, through shame, through the dust of her mother's grave. Words could not wound her any more. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even gentle. "I didn't come here to take anything from you," she said. "I came to say goodbye to a dying man who wanted peace." Her calmness only fueled their rage. "Peace?" Tunde laughed bitterly. "You think peace is yours to give? You ruined everything the moment you walked through those gates." Outside the building, the press grew restless. Cameras flashed as she exited, surrounded by chaos. Questions flew like arrows. "Miss Ifunanya, how do you respond to claims you're a fraud? Are you after the inheritance? Did your father recognize you before his collapse?" She paused at the steps, her face steady under the flashing lights. "I came to forgive, not to fight," she said softly. "Whatever my father chose to leave me is his burden, not my prize." Then she turned away, her silence louder than any defense she could have made. Her humility became her armor. The world, so used to arrogance and greed, didn't know what to do with a woman who refused to play their game. By nightfall, half the city admired her strength, while the other half whispered about her innocence. But within the mansion walls, the storm only grew darker. In her guest room, the walls pulsed with the echoes of raised voices downstairs. Papers slammed, glasses shattered, and the family that once lived off power now devoured itself with envy. Ifunanya sat by the window, watching the city lights blur into the rain-streaked glass. She thought of her mother, of the years spent in silence and struggle, and how cruel fate was, to bring her here not for peace, but for one final war. Her thoughts broke when the door burst open. Tunde stood in the doorway, his face red with fury, his tie loosened, his breath heavy with drink and rage. "Get up," he barked. "You think this is over? You think you can just walk away while we lose everything?" Ifunanya rose slowly, her voice calm. "You're angry, because you think I want what you already lost. Your father's love." He stepped closer, eyes burning. "Don't talk to me about love," he hissed. "He's dying tonight. And you're coming with me to watch him burn." The words hung in the air like lightning before the strike. For a moment, time itself froze. Ifunanya's heart pounded, but her expression stayed unbroken. Outside, thunder rolled over the city as Tunde's shadow loomed larger in the doorway. Somewhere upstairs, a monitor beeped sharply, her father's life hanging by a thread. She took one steady breath, the storm in her eyes finally matching the one outside, and whispered, "Then let's see what dies first. His heartbeat, or your hate." Night had fallen heavy over the Adabanjo mansion, wrapping its marble towers in a suffocating stillness. Outside, rain beat against the windows like a restless drum, echoing the erratic rhythm of Chief Olumide's heart monitor. The storm outside was fierce, but the storm within was quieter, one born not of thunder, but of guilt. The once mighty man who had commanded boardrooms and broken nations with his signature now lay trapped beneath white sheets, waiting for the one person whose forgiveness might still matter. "Send her in," he whispered weakly. "No one else." Ifunanya stood in the doorway, her heart steady, but her body trembling. The room smelled of medicine and dying dreams. Machines beeped softly, their lights casting ghostly reflections across the walls. She stepped closer, her shoes barely making a sound against the cold floor. The man before her no longer looked like a billionaire. He looked like every mistake that had ever learned to breathe. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, his eyes wet with exhaustion, and something deeper: shame. He reached out a trembling hand, but she did not move closer yet. The distance between them held 20 years of silence. "You came," he said, his voice a fragile whisper. "I did," she replied. "You asked for me." He nodded slowly. "Because the truth must live longer than I do." The thunder cracked again outside, rattling the chandelier. His breath came in shallow waves as he struggled to speak. "Your mother, Amara," he began, and just the sound of her name filled the room with ghosts. "She was the only person who ever saw me as a man before I became a monster. I loved her, but I was a coward. I let fear and pride make me cruel." His voice broke. "When I learned she was pregnant, I told myself it was a mistake, that loving her would destroy everything I'd built. So I destroyed her instead." Ifunanya's throat tightened, but she stayed silent. His words poured out like confession in a dying church. "I remember that night," he said. "The rain was just like this. She came to my door, begging me not to do what I'd already decided. I told her to leave, to take you, and go. She begged me, 'Don't let our child grow up hating you.' And I shut the door in her face." He coughed violently, pain seizing his chest. The nurse moved to intervene, but he raised a trembling hand. "Leave us," he gasped. The nurse hesitated, then nodded and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Now it was only father and daughter, and the ghosts of everything unsaid. "I thought I had won," he whispered bitterly. "I married wealthy. I built empires. I sat in rooms where men bowed when I entered. But every night I saw her eyes in the dark, your eyes, and I couldn't sleep. I gave the world my name, but I lost my soul with hers." Tears welled in Ifunanya's eyes, uninvited but unstoppable. She wanted to hate him, to let him die with the weight of his sins. But the small, broken voice before her was not the monster from her mother's stories. It was just a man, one drowning in the same storm he created. "You can't undo what you did," she said softly. "You can't bring her back." "I know," he whispered, "but I can die telling the truth." His breathing grew shallow, the machine's beeps slowing. His trembling hand reached out again, and this time she took it, hesitant, cold, but real. His fingers tightened weakly around hers, his tears mixing with the sound of rain. His eyes fluttered, his voice fading to a fragile whisper. "Forgive me, my daughter." The line on the monitor wavered once, then flattened. A sharp, unending tone filled the room, cutting through the thunder. Ifunanya froze, her hand still locked in his. The storm outside screamed as lightning split the sky, illuminating the silent man on the bed and the daughter who had finally found him. Only to lose him again. Fate, it seemed, wasn't done writing its cruel poetry. The monitor's long, unbroken tone still hung in the air like a funeral song when the nurse burst back into the room, her voice shaking. "He's not gone yet," she shouted. "His pulse. There's still a pulse." In an instant, the room erupted into motion. Doctors rushed in, gloves snapping, voices overlapping. The rain outside thundered harder, slamming against the windows as though heaven itself demanded to see what would happen next. Ifunanya stood frozen at first, her hand still locked in her father's. His skin was cold, yet faintly trembling beneath her palm. One of the nurses tried to move her aside, but she refused. "Let me stay," she whispered, tears cutting lines down her face. "Please, let me stay." The lead doctor gave a quick nod, too busy fighting death to argue. Machines were reconnected, adrenaline injected. The heart monitor spiked, then dipped again. Olumide's chest rose weakly, like a drowning man fighting the tide. Her knees trembled, but she fell beside the bed, clutching his hand tighter. For years she had denied herself this moment, this fragile, painful connection. But now, as she felt his fading heartbeat flutter against her fingers, she could not stop the words that came from deep within her. "Papa," she whispered, voice breaking, the name foreign on her tongue, yet sacred in her heart. "Please don't leave me like this. Not again." The word tore through her chest like a forgotten prayer. Around her, the chaos blurred into echoes, the beeping of machines, the frantic shouts of nurses, the click of heels on marble floors. But in that small space between her trembling fingers and his fading pulse, everything else disappeared. There was no wealth, no betrayal, no past, just a father and a daughter, caught between the living and the lost. Her tears fell onto his hand, soaking into the wrinkles time had carved there. She bowed her head, her voice a whisper of desperation. "If you ever loved her, if you ever loved us, then fight, please." The doctor's voice cut through the air. "We're losing him." He pressed down on Olumide's chest again, counting under his breath. The storm outside roared louder, lightning flooding the room in white bursts of light. The mansion itself seemed to awaken, voices echoing from the hallway. Adaora and Tunde burst into the room, their faces pale with confusion and fury. "What's happening?" Adaora demanded. "Is he alive or not?" The nurse tried to calm her, but she shoved past, her eyes falling on Ifunanya kneeling by the bed. "You," she spat. "This is your fault. You've cursed him." Ifunanya didn't respond. Her hands were trembling too hard, her focus locked on the fragile rhythm of her father's breathing. "He's fighting," she whispered through tears. "Let him fight." "Enough," Tunde shouted, grabbing her arm, but the doctor's voice stopped him cold. "Everyone out," he commanded. "Give him space to breathe. Give him peace." The siblings hesitated, rage battling fear, but the authority in the doctor's voice forced them out. The door closed, leaving only the sound of the rain and the labored breath of a man who refused to die without finishing his story. Minutes passed like hours. The monitor beeped, slow, uneven, but alive. Olumide's eyelids fluttered. His hand twitched weakly in hers. Ifunanya leaned closer, tears still falling. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling with both pain and relief. "Papa, I'm here." The silence stretched thin as dawn waited to break. Then his lips moved. His voice was barely a breath, but she heard it clearly. "You sound like her." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, soft and full of memory. The heart monitor gave one steady beep, then another, then silence. The doctors froze. The room stilled. Outside, lightning struck one final time, flooding the walls with light before fading into quiet darkness. Ifunanya sat motionless, her tears glistening against his still hand. The storm passed, leaving behind a silence too deep for grief, too sacred for words, the kind of silence that only comes when love finally meets its reckoning. The morning after the storm dawned in gold and silence, as though heaven itself had paused to see what would become of the Adebanjo legacy. The mansion that had trembled with rage and grief the night before now stood eerily still, its marble floors reflecting the soft light of a new day. Outside the tall iron gates, the chaos had already begun. Reporters swarmed the entrance like vultures circling the scent of blood and scandal. Cameras flashed. Voices shouted questions that sliced through the morning calm. Will she take the fortune? Is the bastard daughter now the queen? Will she destroy her father's name? Inside, Ifunanya stood by the same window her father had once used to look down on Lagos. the city he had conquered and corrupted in equal measure. Her reflection looked back at her, weary, uncertain, and crowned not by gold, but by responsibility. The lawyer's words from the night before still echoed in her head. You are the legal heir to everything Chief Adabanjo owned. Everything. The house, the businesses, the empire built on pride and pain. It was all hers now, but every corner of it carried her mother's tears and her father's sins. The corridors whispered of judgment as she walked through them. The portraits of men who had ruled the Adabanjo dynasty seemed to glare down at her, their painted eyes asking if she was strong enough to bear the weight of mercy. In the parlor, the servants stood in uneasy silence. Some bowed their heads in respect, others in fear. And then, from behind her, a familiar voice spoke, soft, patient, and wise. It was Reverend Chukwuma, her late mother's old friend and mentor, the man who had once baptized her as a baby. His white robe was simple, his eyes filled with the calm of a man who had seen both faith and failure. I came as soon as I heard, he said gently. The world is watching you now, child. They want to see if pain will make you bitter. Or better. Ifunanya's voice trembled. He destroyed her life, Father. He left her to die with nothing. And now the same people who mocked us call me his heir. It feels wrong, he nodded slowly. It is wrong, but life rarely balances its scales. That's why mercy exists, to finish what justice begins. She turned toward him, tears glistening in her eyes. How can I forgive a man who never gave her peace? Forgiveness, he said, stepping closer, isn't for the dead, my child. It's for the living. Mercy is the loudest justice. You have been handed power, not to avenge her pain, but to prove she raised something stronger than hate. The words settled deep within her, like sunlight through storm clouds. For a long time she said nothing. Then she looked toward the massive staircase that led to the study, where her father's final press conference had been planned. The press outside were waiting. The city was waiting. The ghosts of her past were waiting. When she entered the hall, the sound of camera shutters filled the air like rain. Microphones pointed toward her as dozens of journalists shouted at once. Miss Adabanjo, what will you do with your father's fortune? Will you expose the corruption in his companies? Will you take revenge? She stood before them, tall and still, dressed in white, her mother's color of choice, the color of dignity. For a moment she said nothing, letting the noise die down until the only sound left was the faint hum of lights and the distant cry of the city beyond the gates. I grew up with nothing, she began, her voice calm, every word deliberate. My mother raised me to believe that wealth is not counted in money, but in mercy. My father forgot that truth, and it cost him everything. But I will not repeat his mistakes. Reporters leaned forward. Flashes lit up the hall. She inhaled deeply, her mother's voice whispering in her memory. Never beg a man who left you crying. She looked directly into the cameras, her expression unwavering. I am my mother's daughter, she said softly, her voice trembling with both pain and grace. And I choose grace over greed. The hall fell silent. No one moved. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, washing the mansion in light, as if heaven itself had chosen to believe her. The grand hall of the Adabanjo mansion had never been so silent. The chandeliers that once glittered with pride now shimmered with restraint, their golden light falling softly on faces drawn tight with tension and expectation. The air was heavy with perfume and judgment, the smell of wealth waiting to be divided. Around the long mahogany table sat the family, Olumide's legitimate children stiff with greed, their lawyers whispering behind papers. Servants lined the walls like shadows, unsure if they were witnessing justice or irony. And at the far end of the table, sitting with calm that looked like defiance, was Ifunanya, the daughter who was never meant to return. The lawyer, an elderly man with kind eyes and trembling hands, adjusted his glasses and began to read. His voice carried a quiet weight, the tone of a man unveiling both fortune and forgiveness. "This," he said, unfolding the final page, "is the last will and testament of Chief Olumide AbaA." A faint murmur rippled through the room. Adaiora smirked. Tunde folded his arms, eyes sharp. Ifunanya remained still. The lawyer continued, each word striking the air like a bell, tolling for a soul that had already gone to meet its truth. "I, Chief Olumide AbaA, being of sound mind, do hereby declare that all assets of my estate, including AbaA Holdings, its subsidiaries, and associated wealth, be liquidated over time to fund the following: hospitals in Lagos and Enugu, scholarships for orphans, and a permanent endowment to the Emmanuel School in Enugu, where my daughter's mother once taught." The hall fell silent, a stunned pause. Then whispers exploded. "He gave it away," Tunde barked. "All of it?" The lawyer nodded solemnly. "Yes, all of it." He raised his voice slightly, continuing before interruption could turn to chaos. "The AbaA mansion shall no longer serve as a residence, but as a shelter for women abandoned in hardship, and for single mothers raising their children alone." Adaiora stood up, face pale. "He's lost his mind even in death. That woman poisoned him with guilt." Ifunanya's eyes flicked up, not in anger, but sorrow. "No," she said quietly. "Guilt didn't change him. Love did." Her words silenced the room. For the first time, even the chandeliers seemed to dim, as though the mansion itself bowed its head. The lawyer looked up from the papers, his voice softening. He wrote that wealth without redemption is a curse, that what he built in arrogance, he hoped his children would rebuild in kindness. Ifunanya's eyes blurred with tears. She didn't fight them this time. For years, she had imagined vengeance, imagined taking everything he once used to crush her mother. But this unexpected act of repentance, melted something she thought had died long ago. It wasn't money he left her. It was peace. She looked around the room, at her half-siblings, still fuming, at the staff, quietly weeping, and at the lawyer, who seemed to carry the weight of a man who had read many wills but few this human. Her heart swelled with something she hadn't felt since childhood, the sense that maybe even broken men could find their way back to grace. The lawyer's voice broke the silence again, quieter now, almost reverent. "There is one more item," he said, closing the thick folder before reaching for a small sealed envelope. Its edges were worn, its paper faintly yellowed. He wrote one last letter, addressed only to you, Miss Ifunanya AbaA. The room stilled as all eyes turned to her. The lawyer placed the envelope gently in front of her, his gaze heavy with unspoken emotion. Ifunanya stared at it, her hand trembling. Her father's handwriting curved across the paper, firm yet fading, the ink slightly smudged. She hesitated, her tears falling silently onto the seal. In that fragile moment, between memory and forgiveness, she realized that love, even the kind born too late, still had the power to heal. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Mama, what did he write this time?" The evening sun poured over the red earth like a blessing, as Ifunanya stood before the small grave that had carried her mother's name for 2 decades. The wind whispered softly through the trees, bending the tall grass as though even the earth bowed in reverence. It was peaceful here, far from the chaos of mansions and reporters, far from the noise of inheritance and bloodlines. Only the songs of crickets and the distant laughter of her young son filled the air, wrapping the place in quiet life. She knelt slowly, brushing her fingers over the carved letters on the headstone. Amara Ease, loved in silence, remembered in strength. For years, she had come here searching for answers. Today, she had come with one. In her hand was the envelope that had traveled from the mansion's lawyer's desk to this sacred soil, her father's final letter. The seal had been broken days ago, but she had saved this moment to read it again, aloud, beneath the same sky that once heard her mother's prayers. The paper trembled in her hand as she unfolded it, her breath catching at the sight of his handwriting. Uneven, aged but human. She began softly, her voice breaking the still air. My daughter, Ifunanya. I have little right to call you that, but I write with a heart stripped of pride. I once built walls out of fear, and your mother's love was the only light that dared to climb them. When I shut her out, I thought I was protecting myself. I did not know I was killing everything good within me. Her voice faltered. The words bled into the air, carried by wind that seemed to know their weight. She continued, I left you nothing but pain, yet still you came back. I have no gold left to give, no apology grand enough to erase the past. All I have is a prayer, that through you I might find peace with the woman I wronged. I built my empire in arrogance. You will rebuild it in grace. That will be my redemption. Ifunanya's hands trembled. Tears streamed freely, but they were different now, softer, not born from rage, but release. Around her, the world seemed to glow in a golden hush. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber, the same colors her mother used to love when she told bedtime stories by candlelight. From the distance, her son's laughter echoed again. The little boy ran barefoot through the tall grass, chasing butterflies, free in a way she had never been. She smiled faintly, her tears glistening as she watched him. Her mother had once carried her through storms of shame and survival. Now she was raising a child under open skies, unburdened by the chains of the past. The mansion that once symbolized pain was now filled with women and children like them, safe, fed, and unafraid. What had been a monument to pride was now a sanctuary of mercy. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it beneath the small bouquet of lilies resting at the base of the grave. The wind caught the edge of the paper for a moment, fluttering it like a whisper of farewell before it settled again. She placed her palm flat on the earth, feeling the warmth beneath her skin. Papa, she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of forgiveness. You finally gave her peace. And through that, you gave me freedom. The horizon began to blur as the sun descended, spilling its final light across the fields. Shadows stretched long, touching her feet, touching the grave, uniting them in the quiet language of love that had survived everything: betrayal, time, and death. As the last rays disappeared behind the clouds, Ifunanya looked toward the horizon and whispered, I forgive you, Papa. The wind stilled. For a moment, her shadow stretched beside her mother's, merging into one. 2 women, 2 generations, one story finally closing in grace. The dusk deepened around her, not with darkness, but with peace, as though the heavens themselves had decided that love, at last, had kept its promise. If this story touched your heart, don't let it fade here. Subscribe now and join our growing family that celebrates powerful African stories of love, pain, and redemption. Share this video with someone who believes forgiveness is the strongest form of justice. Your 1 like, 1 comment, and 1 share keep stories like Ifunanya's alive, because every tear deserves to become hope.